hatred towards traditional Judaism. And the Maskilim, as they were called, the members of the Haskell were called the Maskilim would ridicule, mock, and just degrade the rabbis and traditional Jews. And what this did is it just brought a terrible hatred onto themselves. And it made it that whereas in Western Europe, the traditional community looked at Reform as kind of like Nebuch. Oh, it's so sad that moving so far away from traditional Judaism. In Eastern Europe, it was just a bitter hatred that became instilled. Because let's face it, you can have a fight, you can have a theoretical fight, even a practical fight, but no one likes to be mocked, right? Once you start mocking me, I mean, look at what happens in this country, and certain presidents that kept in their arsenal of tools mocking other people. That's part of the reason why I think people don't like. There are those who don't like him so much. So no one likes to be mocked. But that's what happened with the Maskilim. They would mock the rabbis. They would ridicule, torment, and that just led to a terrible situation. Now, it's important to point out that for the most part, in a lot of places in Eastern Europe, even though there were synagogues that were taken over by Maskilim, it doesn't become Reform. It's kind of an interesting thing. Many of the Maskilim synagogues, in other words, those groups of Maskilim that still practiced Judaism, because many didn't, that they still, it was still a more traditional version of Judaism than was found in Western Europe with Reform. But again, the philosophy and the hatred of one group to another is really where the bitter war mounted from. Now, today, Haskalah essentially didn't survive. It didn't make it. It doesn't survive Russia. It doesn't survive Eastern Europe because Haskalah will realize after a couple generations that no matter how much a Jew tries to be a Russian, the Russians will never accept him at all. That the anti-Semitism is not just about the Romanovs and the Russians and not liking how Jews practice. It's not liking Jews altogether. And until you either convert to be a Russian Catholic, Russian Orthodox, or you just stop to exist altogether, the Russians will never accept you. And that was realized all too late in the process here, but that's why today Haskalah doesn't survive at all. When we talked about Western Europe, we talked about Reform surviving because it's recreated in America, and it pivots a couple times that it's been able to survive until today for the most part. But Haskalah will not survive. Now Haskalah takes shape in different forms. Again, all with the goal of recreating the Jew, but all in different forms. There was a group referred to as the Hebrew Haskell, in which they try to take Hebrew and make it a language like French, German, Spanish, a language that was spoken, a language that was used in the press, a language that was used in plays and in literature. The focus of the new Jew was the new Jew has his own language, and it's just like any other language of the world. Now, one thing that we have to point out is even though Haskalah didn't survive the 19th and early 20th century, we're going to see that it is almost reincarnated, or many of those attitudes are going to be brought into modern Zionism. Not religious Zionism, but are going to be brought into modern Zionism. And this concept of the Hebrew Haskalah will survive in the state of Israel in as much as Hebrew will become the language of the modern state of Israel, which when we get there we'll see wasn't so simple. But that's the Hebrew Haskalah. There's also the Yiddish Haskalah. Now the Yiddish Haskalah was the place where things like these Yiddish newspapers that used to exist, Yiddish theater, if you've heard of that, all that came from this Yiddish Haskalah, and again they were running away from traditional Judaism. What's interesting today is in New York, some of those same Yiddish newspapers still exist that had come over with Eastern European Jewry to America from the Yiddish Haskalah, like the Yiddish Forward, the Yiddish Avort, these different things, which were secularist newspapers, but their only readership today are the Hasidim in New York, so they have to cater to their audience. But that was the Yiddish Haskalah. It took Yiddish as language again with literature, theater, and that was their focus. And it was another group that was just the out and out Russian Haskalah. They were just trying to make Jews Russian. They were trying to show the Tsar that Jews were really Russians, and they thought if the Jews would become Russians, then they wouldn't be treated so poorly. They were wrong, but that was the Russian Haskalah. And then there's also just the out-and-out socialist Haskalah. Now, this was actually an offshoot of the Yiddish Haskalah, but these were the Jewish socialist groups who adopted the ideas of Karl Marx, who will eventually be very involved in the Russian Revolution and the Soviet Revolution in Russia. But these are groups like the Bund, if you've ever heard of them, and they were very much a part of the socialist struggle. The idea that the workers of the world will unite against the proletariat, and against the aristocracy, and there was the Jewish socialists that will continue to exist in the form of people like Leon Trotsky and Alexa Rosenberg and the like. And these are just the different aspects, the different concepts of Haskalah that existed. Now, because their goal was to make Jews Russian, or make Jews into Russians, the Haskalah in general supported the Russian government because they thought that's how they're going to ingratiate themselves with them. And therefore, they not only supported the Russian government, but they supported the persecution of the Russian government because they figured that the persecution would help to break down the traditional Jew and break down the traditional Jewish communities. And then the Haskalah would jump in to rebuild. So therefore, they were part and parcel with all of the different decrees. They worked hand in hand with the Russians to try and take down the traditional Jewish community. Now, this took the form of the very harsh decrees against Jewish observance in many parts of the Russian Empire, and it's also took the form of schools. That the Tsar sets up a Jewish school system. Officially, the Chadarim, the Cheder, became illegal, and these Russian schools were set up to try and indoctrinate the Jewish community into becoming basically Russian Orthodox, and they're becoming Russians. Now, luckily, the Romanovs were always terribly dysfunctional, and the Russian Empire was always corrupt and terribly dysfunctional, could often be brought out. So they had no efficiency. They didn't have the efficiency of the Germans, where real disaster was done. So they were not able to really roll out the school system in force or roll out the decrees properly. But in many of the Jewish communities, they did have the help of the Maskilim to try and get these things done. So the battle at this point with the anti-Semitism in Russia, in many ways similar to other points in history, like the times of the Hanukkah story, for example, it was Jew against Jew. It was the Maskilim against the traditional Jews. Now, the Maskilim made the mistake that they thought that the traditional Jew was just going to roll over and play dead, that they would be so enchanted and enthralled by the concept of Haskalah that they would take off the yarmulke, take off the tzitzis, and run to become Maskilim, and the opposite happened. If anything, the Maskilim just helped to embolden different Jewish groups, and the battles and the wars became fierce. So in places of Europe where, like we mentioned before, Galicia, where the Hasidim were popular, the Hasidim fought Haskalah tooth and nail. They were one of the main opponents of the Haskalah in the areas where they thrived, and that was the battle in those areas. But in other areas, there were, in other areas like Lithuania, primarily, where there are no Hasidim, another movement develops, and that is the Yeshiva Movement. And eventually we'll have an offshoot of the Yeshiva Movement that we'll talk about next week called the Musar Movement, and together these three movements, or 2/3 movements of the Hasidim, the Yeshiva Movement, and the Musar Movement, will be the counterforce to Haskalah to keep it that at the end of Eastern European Jewry, there are still some traditional Jews to come to America and in Eretz Yisrael and Israel and England to rebuild Judaism after World War I and World War II and the destruction of European Jewry. Now, it's really sad when we talk about the Maskilim working with the Russian government, because they just totally underestimated the anti-Semitism, and the fact that they could work with such evil people was just a total misunderstanding of what they were trying to do. But okay, let's go on to the Yeshiva Movement. So the Yeshiva Movement, as we know it, was in many ways a response to Haskalah. It looked at what was felt were certain valid arguments that the Haskalah had against the Jewish community, that they looked at the Jewish community and made certain comments that were valid, and the Yeshiva Movement, and more so the Musar Movement, aimed to change those within the traditional community. And what's important to point out, we've talked about this before, but we look at yeshivas today and we think, oh, they've been here since Babylon, but no, they haven't been. There was essentially a lack of a system that was in place for hundreds of years, for sure in Eastern Europe, Western Europe, long before the yeshiva system of the 19th century started. And the system was essentially that if you had a boy who showed promise in learning, he would study with a rabbi of his town, and then when he would sort of outgrow that rabbi of his small town, he'd go to a bigger town to study with a bigger rabbi and bigger scholars. And that was really the system. There was essentially no system. It was an anti-system. But the benefit of this system is there was no room and board, no tuition, no building, no fundraising. You didn't have to have any of that. That was really the what existed beforehand. Now, there was one man who looked at this system initially in the 17th century and said that is not going to stand the test of time, and the winds that were blowing in the world of emancipation and Haskalah. And that man was Reb Chaim Volozhiner, who we spoke about last week, who was the Talmud of the Vilna Gaon, and he was a great scholar in his own right. Tremendous stature, had tremendous respect. He was a rabbi in many places before he came back to his hometown of Volozhin. And Volozhin, he opened the yeshiva that he had discussed and conceptualized together with the Vilna Gaon during his lifetime. And in 1803, the Volozhiner yeshiva opens. Now, Volozhin today is not so far from Minsk in modern-day Belarus, and it's a building that's actually been back in the hands of the Jewish community since the late 90s. I was able to visit it when I took a trip to Eastern Europe in the early 2000s, and but the concept was such. The concept was to have one central yeshiva in Europe where all the great minds of Europe would come to, and it would have a set curriculum. It would have classes. It would have great teachers as the educators. And the goal was to produce true Talmidei Chachamim, true scholars of Torah, and also to produce leaders. In other words, Reb Chaim Volozhiner, whereas today the yeshiva system is not necessarily producing rabbis, the goal is not necessarily to only produce, it does produce rabbis, that's where rabbis come from, but the goal is not to only produce rabbis. To quote my Rosh Yeshiva, Rav Yaakov Weinberg, that every Jewish boy should really go to yeshiva and even stay in yeshiva for at least 1 to 3 years after marriage, whether he's going to become a doctor, lawyer, or Indian chief, he needs that basis of some time in yeshiva. But that was not the concept originally. The concept was it was for the scholars and the leaders and to build the leaders of the Jewish people. And that goal was achieved to a T, because we'll see that Volozhin, which will exist itself for about 100 years, will provide the leadership of European Jewry for 100 solid years. And all of the leaders of Europe will come from Volozhin, and all of the greatness of the time period of the 19th and early 20th century of Eastern European Jewry, while together hand in hand with the hardship of the Haskalah and the Romanovs and the Russians, etc., we're going to see that is there's a certain amount of thriving, a tremendous amount of thriving that comes through the yeshiva system. And Volozhin is looked as the aim ha-yeshivas, the mother of yeshivas, because we're going to see in a moment how many offshoots came in the time of a century. Now, part of the concept was that there was a lot of competition for the Jewish minds now. So Reb Chaim Volozhin said we have to get the best Jewish minds and keep them in the Jewish community and to make them into the leaders that we need. Now, as much as there are many yeshivas that are going to open up in Eastern Europe at this time, like we said, it's still an elitist movement. Not only Volozhin, but all of them. It's not for every Jewish boy. At its height, maybe there were 4,000 or 5,000 students in yeshivas in Eastern Europe. Now, that's compared to today, where the biggest yeshiva alone of the Mir Yeshiva has something like 10,000 students, and I think the biggest yeshiva in America, Lakewood, has something like 10,000 students, and there's probably, I would say, 40 or 50,000 yeshiva students today. Baruch Hashem, Kein Yirbu. But in Europe, it's maybe a tenth of that. Maybe 10% of that is what we see in the yeshiva system in Europe. And so the other concept of the yeshiva is that along with all these other details, is that the learning should be communal. And this is the concept of the big base medrash that we see in yeshivas today, that everyone should study together in one room, that there should be a noise, a rash gadol, a kol haTorah as we call it, the voice of the Torah, and be an enthusiasm. And that's you take somebody from sort of the secular academia and bring them into yeshiva study hall, and they're like, what the heck is this? You have 400, 500, 600 Jewish boys between the ages of 18 and 40 who are yelling at each other, discussing Talmudic texts. Whereas if you walk into Harvard or Yale or Princeton, the library is very quiet. You can only whisper. Totally different pedagogical approach. But it's about the enthusiasm of Torah learning. And hand in hand with that, said Reb Chaim Volozhiner, is it has to be done through total joy. It has to be done through joy, the simchas Torah, the happiness of Torah learning. Now, don't think that Reb Chaim Volozhiner, with all his stature and respect, that he just walked in and opened the yeshiva. He had a lot of opposition. He had opposition from the Maskilim as they gained power. There was opposition from the Hasidim, and even opposition from the plain old traditional, as they called them, Ashkenazim at the time, because people looked at the funds that it was going to take to open these yeshivas, and this is the Russian Empire we're talking about. The trait of the Jewish community of the Russian Empire was poverty, and now he's going to go and fundraise for a yeshiva. And in a lot of cases, the way that because the point of Volozhin was to cater to the whole of European Jewry, that Reb Chaim and his successors would go to Jewish communities around Europe and raise money, and a deal of sorts was struck that if you supported 5% of the yeshiva, then we would save 5% of the chairs for boys from your town. So that means if you had at least, let's say that Volozhin had about 400 students at any given time, so you get 20 seats. And assuming you had 20 boys who were worthy, they would definitely get into the yeshiva. We'd save seats for them, which isn't such a great system, but again, trying to put together the funds for this yeshiva in that time period was not an easy thing either. The fundraising of today is literally a cakewalk compared to what it was at that time. Now, the average day of a student of Volozhin was about 18 hours. In other words, the students would study for about 18 hours, and in 6 hours they would eat, sleep, daven, and do whatever else they needed to do. There was not a lot of free time in this yeshiva. And some students even would go 36 hours straight and then sleep for 10 hours and get up and do it all over again. That's probably where the concept of residency for doctors came from. So the system was intense. And in fact, they even had a schedule in Volozhin that somebody was always learning 24/7, no matter what. So even times where, even with the schedule of, obviously if you have people 18-hour days was the average, and some people doing 36 hours, the base medrash was active 24/7, but you would have days, let's say like Yom Kippur, after they break the fast, different times like that, where maybe there'd be a lull in the learning, but the yeshiva would make sure that there was always someone learning 24/7, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, or 354 on the Jewish calendar, unless it's a leap year, 383. But there was always someone learning in Volozhin. And this concept, actually, Reb Chaim Volozhiner talks about in his monumental work, the Nefesh Chaim, where he talks about the idea that based on the idea of the prophet Yirmiyahu, where he says, where quoting the Almighty, he says that I made a covenant with the heaven and the earth, the earth. And Reb Chaim Volozhiner explains over there that meant that once the Torah was given to the Jewish people, that the covenant between the Jewish people and, so to speak, the Almighty and the heavens and the earth is that there always has to be someone learning that Torah. And if, God forbid, there would ever be a moment where Torah learning would cease in the world, then the statutes of the world wouldn't exist either. And therefore, Reb Chaim Volozhiner made sure that the Ema Yeshivas, that the Volozhin Yeshiva took responsibility for that, and that there would always 24/7 be someone learning Torah. Now, the curriculum in Volozhin was the entirety of the Talmud, the complete Shas. The goal was when you were, during your time period in the Yeshiva of Volozhin, you would complete the whole entire Talmud, and there are those who even did it twice in their tenure at the Yeshiva. And what was interesting is this is, even though we're after the Gutenberg press at this point, still we're in poor Russia, so the whole entire Volozhin Yeshiva was said to only have one complete one complete set of the Shas, of the Talmud, one complete Talmud. So therefore, what they did to counteract the lack of books that they had is certain students were assigned certain tractates. So there's 36 tractates in the Talmud, so there were 36 specific students who were who were assigned a tractate, and it was their goal to know that tractate by heart. So, for example, there's one guy who had to know tractate Brachos by heart, one guy who had to know tractate Shabbos by heart, one Eruvin, etc., etc., etc. And the idea was, because there's only one Shabbos, one Eruvin, one Brachos, etc., but you had that guy who was the living library. So if you needed to know what it said on, Daf Kuf Yod Aleph Amud Aleph in Masechta Shabbos, page 111a, and Tractate Shabbos, then if the book was available, you went to ask the Shabbos guy, and he could quote it for you, because it's his job to know it ba'al peh, his job to know it by heart. Now, one other interesting thing that took place with many of the, not only in Volozhin, but with many of the European yeshivas, is the Rosh Yeshiva, the Dean of the Yeshiva, was also the chief rabbi of the town. And that was really a goal, to keep a certain amount of synergy in the communities. And interestingly enough, in places where that didn't happen, there was often conflict between the two positions. Now, besides building the mother of yeshivas, and which we'll see in a moment sparked and spawned off many other yeshivas, Reb Chaim Volozhin also built a dynasty of Rosh Yeshiva, a dynasty of Torah learning. Because we'll see that when Reb Chaim Volozhin, he'll lead the yeshiva until his death, and then his son, Reb Itzel Volozhin, or Reb Yitzchak Volozhin, will take over at the time of his father's passing. And then, when he passes away, the grandson and the son-in-law of Rav Itzla Volozhiner, whose name was Rav Eliezer Fried, will take over as a Rosh Yeshiva. Now, in Europe, that was not uncommon for people to marry their first cousins. I know nowadays we think about that as not so beseder, and maybe it's led to some of the genealogical problems that we have in the Ashkenazi community. But it was a common thing in Eastern Europe. So Rav Eliezer Fried married his first cousin. He was a grandson of Rav Chaim Volozhiner. He married his first cousin, Rav Itzla's daughter, and then he became the third Rosh Yeshiva of the Volozhin Yeshiva. Now, unfortunately, he did not live very long, and he passed away in 1854. Whereupon we had two candidates to be the fourth Rosh Yeshiva of Volozhin. And the two candidates were a rabbi by the name of Rav Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, and on the other hand, now Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin was he had married the granddaughter of Rav Chaim Volozhiner, and on the other hand, we had Rav Yosef Ber Soloveitchik, who was a great grandson of Rav Chaim Soloveitchik. of Rav Chaim Volozhiner. You got to keep the family tree straight in your head, right? So you can look it up online afterwards. But basically, we had the Netziv, who we call him Yehuda Berlin, the Netziv, who was married to a granddaughter, and one generation down, we had Rav Yosef Dov Soloveitchik, also known by the monumental work he wrote called the Beis HaLevi, who was one generation down because he was a great-grandson of Rav Chaim Volozhiner. So we had a grandson-in-law and a great-grandson, and it was unclear who should be the Rosh Yeshiva. So there was a Din Torah held. Now this is a Din Torah, meaning a rabbinic court, but it was b'shalom, right? As it's recorded, there were no fights. They just weren't sure who should do it. So the Din Torah came out that the Netziv, Rav Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, in fact, should be Rosh Yeshiva, maybe because he was older, whatever the reasoning was, and that the Beis HaLevi, Rav Yosef Ber Soloveitchik, should be the Sagan Rosh Yeshiva, should be the assistant. And that was what was decided, and that was a system that lasted for about a decade until Rav Yasha Ber went to Tzlutz to become the rabbi there, and he eventually left Tzlutz because of the pressure from the Maskilim there to go to the town of Brisk in 1877. He took over for Rav Yeshua Leib Diskin, who was the Rav of Brisk, and Rav Yosef Ber Soloveitchik becomes the Rav in Brisk, beginning the Brisker dynasty. So we know that many of us know that the Soloveitchik family and Brisk are umbilically tied, but the Soloveitchik family actually starts in Volozhin and is part of the family of Chaim Volozhiner, and is an offshoot of that with the great dynasty of Brisk that is formed. Now, even though the Beis HaLevi, Rav Yosef Ber Soloveitchik, goes to Brisk, and starts his own life there, and it doesn't work out with him being the Sagan Rosh Yeshiva under the Netziv, they're still very much part of the same family, because we see that the Netziv marries his granddaughter off to Rav Yoshe Ber Soloveitchik's son, whose name was Rav Chaim, aka Rav Chaim Soloveitchik, who's often referred to we often refer to him as the Brisker Rav, often refer to his son as the Brisker Rav, but the great Rav Chaim Soloveitchik. And in 1880, the Netziv actually asked for his grandson-in-law, Rav Chaim Soloveitchik, to come and help him in the yeshiva. So in 1880, Rav Chaim Soloveitchik becomes the Sagan Rosh Yeshiva, becomes the assistant Rosh Yeshiva of the Volozhiner Yeshiva, and will lead it for the next 12 years together with his grandfather-in-law, slash, forget how else it is in the family, uncle-in-law, but whatever it is. And the Netziv and Rav Chaim Soloveitchik will lead the Volozhiner Yeshiva from 1880 together from 1880 until 1892. Now, unfortunately, in 1892, at this point, the Russian government had been putting tremendous pressure on the Volozhiner Yeshiva because, partially due to the Maskilim telling them that this was a hotbed for why the Jews wouldn't be Russian, and partially because just their own anti-Semitism, and they were pushing the Volozhiner Yeshiva to have secular studies and to teach Russian culture and whatnot. And for a number of years, the Netziv and Rav Chaim Soloveitchik were able to basically come to accommodation, aka bribe their way out of it. But finally, in 1892, the pressure became way too great, and the decrees that were put on the yeshiva were such that the Russian government required all teachers of all subjects, even Talmud, to have college diplomas, meaning from the Russian universities, and no Judaic subjects could be taught between 9 a.m. and 3 p.m. They either had to be taught before 9 or after 3, and from 9 to 3 should be dedicated to secular studies, and no night classes were allowed, and the total hours of study per day could not exceed 10 hours. And basically, the Netziv and Reb Chaim looked at the situation and they said, this is untenable. And they ended up saying, better to close the yeshiva than to have it under those restrictions. And therefore, in 1892, the Netziv and Reb Chaim Soloveitchik closed the yeshiva. The Netziv would actually pass away a year later. He did have two sons of note. One was Rav Chaim Berlin, who was the namesake for the Chaim Berlin Yeshiva and Yeshivas B'nai Chaim Berlin in Brooklyn. And the other one was Meir Berlin, who moves to Israel and changes and Hebraicizes his name, which was common, to Bar Ilan, and the Bar Ilan University is named after him. So both have institutions, slightly different institutions, named after the sons of the Netziv. Rav Chaim goes back to Brisk to work with his father, and that really is the beginning of the true Brisker dynasty as we see it today, with all its offshoot yeshivas. We have several Brisker yeshivas and throughout Eretz Yisrael, throughout Israel. There's other Brisker style yeshivas in other places, but that is the great dynasty that starts in Volozhin, goes to Brisk, goes back to Volozhin, goes and it ends up in Brisk, where they also open the yeshiva, the great Brisker yeshiva, and the Brisker dynasty is started at that point. Now, the Russian government made a mistake over here that they thought that Volozhin was the problem, but didn't realize that these other yeshivas were also a threat. So even though, and again, because they're totally dysfunctional, they often did not put the same pressure on places like Brisk and the other yeshivas, but there was definitely issues with the Russian government as well, but never as much as there was in Volozhin. Now, some of the other first generation or offshoot yeshivas of Volozhin besides Brisk is the Mir Yeshiva, which today is the largest yeshiva in the world. The Mir Yeshiva is founded in the modern day city of Mir in the modern day country of Belarus, then part of Lithuania, and started started also as an offshoot of the Volozhiner Yeshiva, and that was basically the second yeshiva started, and it was one of the largest before the war, and it survived the war because the Mir Yeshiva exists in a very prominent way in Jerusalem, as we mentioned, in a little bit of a smaller way, but still prominent way in New York. And the Mir Yeshiva is able to survive Europe, as maybe we'll talk to later during the war, and the really miraculous story of the Mir Yeshiva being saved intact from Belarus on the Trans-Siberian Railroad to eventually to Shanghai, where it sat out the war. Then it came here to New York, and then the branch opens in Jerusalem. Okay, that's Mir Yeshiva. The Telz Yeshiva. I'm sitting here in Cleveland, so of course I have to mention the Telz Yeshiva. Telz Yeshiva also started by a student of, actually it was Yisrael Salanter, who'll talk about a little bit more next week, in the town of Telz, Lithuania. And it'll also survive the war with some of its staff, the children of the Rosh Yeshiva, the children, grandchildren of the Rosh Yeshiva, coming here to America before the war and sitting out the war here in America, and eventually opening up here after the war in Cleveland with branches in Chicago, Riverdale, and there were attempts at branches in Israel that never really made it, but that's the great Telz Yeshiva from Telz, Lithuania. And one of the probably most famous was the Slobodka Yeshiva. Now, the Slobodka Yeshiva was started in a small suburb of Kovna. Kovna was a major city of Lithuania, capital of Lithuania, and Slobodka was like a suburb, like the Jewish suburb, if you will. And Slobodka we'll talk about a lot next week with the Muslim movement. And Slobodka is really going to be the yeshiva that is going to spawn off not just survivors of Europe, like in the case of Mir and Telz, but it's going to spawn off myriads of yeshivas, including my own alma mater, Yeshivas Ner Yisrael in Baltimore, which will be an offshoot of the great Slobodka Yeshiva. But we'll focus on that a lot next week with the Muslim movement, because that will really be a lot of the heart of the Muslim movement will come out of the Slobodka Yeshiva. Now, around the same time that Volozhin was started, there was also a yeshiva started in Pressburg, which is modern-day Bratislava, and it was a major city in the Habsburg Empire and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And in general, the Austro-Hungarian Empire was a more benevolent empire to the Jews. Officially, their official state policy was that Jews were protected. That was the state policy. It wasn't like Russia, where state policy was 1/3 conversion, 1/3 expulsion, and 1/3 extermination, but Jews were protected officially. Now, the Habsburgs were still latent anti-Semites, and we'll see because of the protection that more and more Jews will move there, and unfortunately that will fuel the anti-Semitism, because you can have like theoretical anti-Semitism without Jews, but you can't have practical anti-Semitism. But be it as it may, as a state level, officially they supported the Jew, and beyond that, in Hungary, in Austria-Hungary, the Jews weren't poor. There was actually affluent Jews, and definitely not poor like the Russians, and there's a lot more money to be had in the Austro-Hungarian Empire for the Jew. Now, this definitely trickles down to America, where you see the Hungarian Jewish communities, which have a reputation for being a little bit ostentatious. Well, that was in their mother's milk, because Hungarian Jews had wealth long before any other Jews, long before Eastern European Jews, even in many ways more than Western European Jews. Now, the yeshiva will be opened in Pressburg, but the Austro-Hungarian Empire in general also. Reform had made its way there to a certain extent, and the Hasidim had come there also. The famous Satmar Hasidim are in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and many, many others. There are many other parts of the Austro-Hungarian Empire where we see the Hasidim take hold. But the person of note that we need to talk about is a rabbi by the name of Rav Moshe HaShreiber, Moshe Sofer, aka the Chasam Sofer. That was one of his monumental works that was written posthumously, actually. Most of the writings we have from the Chasam Sofer were not written by him. They're written posthumously, but Chasam Sofer was the name of his major work, and it was one of the things he was referred to because Chasam was Chacham, was supposed to be Chacham Sofer. It was like a shortening of that name. So Rav Moshe Sofer was a Talmud, was a student of Rav Nosson Adler, who was a major rabbi and Kabbalist in Frankfurt in Germany. But he was also a controversial figure. He made many controversial decisions. So he was eventually, not so welcome in Frankfurt, and therefore made his way to Moravia in the Czech Republic, where he had an opportunity to become a rabbi there. And his student, Rav Moshe Sofer, follows him. And that's how Rav Moshe Sofer leaves Germany and becomes part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Now, Rav Moshe Sofer is the biggest foe to reform in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Even though reform had started to make some waves in Austria-Hungary, we're going to see that it is vehemently put down and basically stopped in its tracks by Rav Moshe Sofer. So he becomes the Rav in Pressburg, and he builds a yeshiva, a huge yeshiva, 500 students, and it is a very innovative yeshiva. He has a lot of innovations there that didn't exist in other yeshivas. For example, he required a speech course. All students in the yeshiva had to learn how to speak publicly. Nowadays, that doesn't exist. But beyond that, he was actually a licensed institution of the Habsburg Empire, of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and because of that, he had secular studies in the yeshiva. Like, this isn't talked about quite often. The Pressburg yeshiva actually had secular studies that were attended, and it was part of the system. Now, it's interesting that because the yeshiva was officially licensed by the empire, that meant that when exams were given, you had to have a proctor from the empire there as well. So you would go in for your exams, which were always oral, and you'd have two of the rabbis of the yeshiva plus someone from the Austro-Hungarian Empire who didn't understand a word of what was being discussed, but he had to be there sitting on the dais because those was required by the empire. Now, to show the stature that the Chasam Sofer had in Pressburg and in the empire in general, is that if you wanted to become a rabbi in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, you had to have a letter from the Chasam Sofer to certify that you were a rabbi. In other words, you didn't necessarily have to have smicha from the Chasam Sofer, but you had to have a letter written to the empire, written to the government, saying that the Chasam Sofer approved your smicha, so to speak. Now, this is one of the many ways that the Chasam Sofer was able to stop reform in its tracks, because Reform rabbis couldn't get a foothold at all, because sure enough, they wouldn't get a letter from the Chasam Sofer, and therefore wouldn't be recognized from the government, and therefore could not open Jewish institutions in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Now, besides this, what the Chasam Sofer would do is he would not only build up leaders like they did in Volozhin, but he would work tenaciously to get his students into every possible rabbinical position and every possible community in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And what those rabbis would do is they would follow the model of the Chasam Sofer. They would not only become the Rav of the community, but they would open smaller yeshivas in the communities. So therefore, a network of yeshivas was started where all these small communities throughout the Austro-Hungarian Empire had students of the Pressburg yeshiva from the Chasam Sofer. They'd open their small yeshiva, and they would send their top students to Pressburg, so to speak, to the mothership to develop the major leaders. So it was like a system, like you had your AAA yeshivas and your AA yeshivas, and you had your major league yeshiva in Pressburg, which all the greatest minds of the Austro-Hungarian Empire will go to, and that's what he built in Pressburg, keeping reform basically out of the country and building a major system of yeshivas that unfortunately would be wiped out with World War I. It's interesting, as we're getting closer and closer to the great world wars, World War I and World War II, we're going to see that even though in numbers World War II killed far many more Jews than World War I, we're going to see the communities are basically uprooted at the time of World War I. So this great Pressburg system that was built by the Chasam Sofer unfortunately will not survive World War I, but it was one that made an indelible mark on the Jewish people. And all these yeshivas spawn off many other yeshivas to the point where we are today, where thank God we have hundreds, if not thousands, of yeshivas in North America, in Eretz Yisrael for sure, in Israel for sure, a few in England, a few still in France, a few in other places in the world, a few in South Africa, and they're all offshoots of these originals. So it was a major movement that takes over the Jewish world that will go through a certain transformation of the Musar movement, which we'll talk about more next week, and what that does to the Yeshiva movement. But it is definitely a movement that saved the Jewish world. I'm not bashful in saying that we are all here today because of Chaim Volozhiner and Rav Moshe Sofer and these yeshivas that started in Europe and gave us our system that we have today. Now, it is interesting to point out, we talked a couple sessions ago about the Hasidim and their contribution to the Jewish world, and Rebbe One always makes a point that one of the reasons why the war that had started between the Hasidim and the non-Hasidim, that it was eventually put down, is because both groups kind of took what was good from the other one and they were able to live in peace. So that's why when we walk into the Lithuanian yeshivas, Lithuanian synagogues, we have singing, not that dissimilar to what the Hasidim brought. Upshirins, anyone gives their child an upshirin, a 3-year-old haircut, that's a Hasidic custom, so forth and so on. The Hasidim will also take the concept of the Lithuanian yeshiva, and we're going to have major Hasidic yeshivas that are going to start as well. The most famous of them is the Chachmei Lublin, and started by Meir Shapiro in the town of Lublin in Poland, and which will become a major yeshiva. It'll become actually the biggest of the pre-war yeshivas. Fortunately, it'll be shut down by the Nazis. The building will be made a police station for the Nazis after all of the books are burned in the public square, and after the war it'll become a medical college. Eventually it'll be given back back to the Jewish community of Warsaw, who has rebuilt it and refurbished it with a synagogue and a mikveh and a hotel. Essentially, they put a hotel there. Unfortunately, it's kind of sad if you look on their website that kosher meals can be provided, but the kitchen's not kosher, which I wonder what Reb Meir Shapiro, looking down from Shemaim, thinks about the fact that in the Chachmei Lublin, the hotel that exists there now, the kitchen's not kosher. But be it as it may, the Hasidim take the concept of the Lithuanian yeshiva as well. So that's what they take from the Lithuanian community. The Lithuanian community takes many great things from the Hasidic community, and today, Baruch Hashem, we're able to live in peace because we realize the common foe of Haskalah, really, and the Russians and the assimilation, and therefore the war that existed at the time of the Vilna Gaon and the students of the Baal Shem Tov, by this point is long gone, and both communities are essentially working together to save the Jewish people. I look forward to discussing these things more with you next week, and I want to thank you for coming, thank you for listening, and we'll talk to you next time. Have a great week.